So what I want to talk about this morning is two closely related subjects, which are purity and perfectionism. Purity and perfectionism. And I think one of our tendencies as Zen practitioners is a tendency towards both of those things. And not entirely surprisingly, if we look, there's a whole passel of folks here who've been to Zen Mountain Monastery, for example. And the striving towards perfectionism in Japanese Zen, it's not something that Zen Mountain or Daido created, it comes from Japan, is incredible. And so, all the way down to things like people wearing robes. Every robe is perfectly pressed. Every fold is just the way it's supposed to be. And that's a tendency that we inherited from our Japanese Zen ancestors. And again, at a big monastic center like that, the main service participants practice for hours to get their role in the service right. If you're there and you're in the service, for example, let's say your job is to hit a bell, you're trained in how to hit that bell. And then you practice how to hit that bell so that you're doing it in exactly the right way. Now, even at Treetop, where we have services, we can't even begin to strive in that direction, because you've got to have a residential monastic community who can practice every day. If you have a service once a week or once a month or whatever it is, then you can't possibly maintain that degree of perfection. So striving for perfection is part of our heritage. And yet it is impossible. Right? Perfection is unattainable. It is impossible to attain perfection. But I think we have that tendency. It's in our Zen blood. And I think many of us bring it in our lives. We bring it in our lives. And we've got a whole mythology, or quasi-mythology, that supports us. We stand on the shoulders of these giants. One of the greatest giants is a man named Bodhidharma. What do we know about Bodhidharma? Well, we don't know that anything we know about Bodhidharma is absolutely true. But a few years ago, I read a book. Andy Ferguson wrote a book called Finding Bodhidharma. And he went to China, and he went to all of the places that Bodhidharma allegedly had visited and so on. And he found evidence that Bodhidharma had been there, that this was a real man, that this was not just a mythological figure, that he had existed, that in fact, there was an Indian monk this way. So what do we know about Bodhidharma? What does the myth tell us? Well, when he was in his 80s, he left India and traveled to China. Okay. I'm not even quite in my 80s yet. He had to take a boat to somewhere in South Asia, Vietnam or Thailand, someplace, and then journeyed up into China on foot. So this in itself is extraordinary, right? a man. And by the way, the other part of the story is that he lived to about 120. So when he was 80, he was just getting started. And he gets there, and some of you have the koan that have been visited the koan with us. He gets there, and he goes to the palace of Emperor Wu. Now, Emperor Wu was a great patron of Buddhism, and in fact, Buddhism in China flourished under Wu's reign. But Wu's patronage consisted of building elaborate temples. And he thought that he was gaining good karma for his next life by building these temples, many of which are quite famous in China even today. So Bodhidharma gets there, and there's a little dialogue that's a koan so that some of you that have been visited that will remember. And Wu totally blows it. Because again, he's sort of got this materialistic concept of Buddhism. And Bodhidharma, essentially in an act of protest, goes off. The koan talks about he crosses the Yangtze River, and he goes and he finds a cave, and he spends the next 8 years in the cave in meditation. Now, if your eyebrows go up some over this, I'm not surprised. Okay, here's where it gets pretty mythical. And speaking of that, what Bodhidharma allegedly did, the story says, he cut off his eyelids so that he wouldn't have to sleep. And he remained 8 years in Zazen, not sleeping. Now, that might sound extreme to some of you. Not nearly as extreme as Bodhidharma's descendant, the first patriarch, who again, there's a koan about him. He's standing outside of the cave, begging instruction from Bodhidharma, and Bodhidharma refuses to see him. He's out there in the snow. It's the middle of winter, and he's out there freezing, and Bodhidharma won't even let him in the cave. So in order to make a good impression, he cuts off his arm. So he does a self-amputation, standing in the snow, and Bodhidharma says, okay, come on in, I'll teach you. So this is the story. Is it true? Is it not true? Some of it clearly is impossible. Other parts, who knows? But Andy Ferguson has confirmed there really was a Bodhidharma. He really did travel from India to China, etc. But is it any wonder that perfectionism is part of our tradition? It's really kind of fanaticism, right? I mean, it's like, okay, whack your arm off. I think I'm going to start that, you want to dice on with me, at least a finger, I show some sincere intent. Well, that was the other thing. Just to get into a monastery in those times, you had to stand outside the gate for days and at the mercy of the weather, whether it was hot or winter or whatever it was, to show before they would even let you in the gate. And in many of those monasteries, you had to be there 2 or 3 years before the teacher would even talk to you. Right? But there was probably some pragmatic considerations to that, because some of those monasteries had 1,500 monks. So the teacher really had to triage who they were going to spend their time with. And if you hadn't shown devotion to practice and you hadn't stuck it out for a few years, then they weren't going to spend time with you. But this is what we come from. So I could go on, right? But we come from a long lineage of extremists. Perfectionists. And yet we know that perfection is impossible. It's unattainable. It cannot happen. You know, when I lived out in the West, I had a number of indigenous American friends who did traditional crafts. And one of the things they used to do was make a deliberate error right at the start of whatever project they were doing, so that freed them from perfectionism. There was no way their work could be perfect because they had already screwed it up quite deliberately. I think that's a brilliant practice that we should maybe employ more in our lives. Because not only in Zen do we have myths of perfectionism, but in our culture here we have myths of perfectionism. And if by some chance we happen to be human, and if by some chance we happen to screw up once in a while, there's something wrong with us. Right? What a pernicious myth that somehow our humanity is an error, is a problem. Now, the cousin to perfectionism is purity. Very close, right? So in our Zen practice, we can have both those things, right? I'm going to sit an hour a day and I'm never going to miss sitting, and I'm going to concentrate my mind perfectly all of that time, and I'm not going to have any thoughts. And guess where that goes? Stuff happens. We get busy. We can't sit an hour every day. Then what? Oh, now I'm screwing up. I'm not dedicated enough. Again, we sort of pathologize ourselves. We're incredibly busy and we're doing the best we can, but we're falling short. We have these insane expectations. In the midst of our crazy, complicated lives. And they get crazier and they get more complicated all the time. And somehow we as lay people are supposed to create a perfect practice amidst that. So I think that what we need to do is redefine what perfect practice means and is. What perfectionism is. Perfect practice is doing the best that we can with what we have. Doing the best we can with what we have. Things happen. Look what Susan told us earlier about Deirdre. All of a sudden, Deirdre's mother-in-law is in critical care. Whatever she planned for today isn't going to happen because she's at the hospital, right? These things happen in our lives. There are so many contingencies that come up. I mean, that's a pretty extreme one, but there are myriads. And so we have constantly, the standard that I believe we adhere to is we're doing the best we can with what we have. And some days that means you're going to have a lot of time to sit and you'll be able to practice deeply and your mind is going to be focused and you're going to, oh, this is great. In other days, your life is going to be in chaos and turmoil. You're going to be busy, and you can't get your mind to settle for even 5 minutes. It's going to happen. It's the nature of our lives. It's the nature of our practice. Now, perfectionism can really defeat us because in not attaining it, we can get discouraged. I'm not a good student. I'm not trying hard enough. Most of us have free access to abundant guilt and shame that we can utilize at those moments. So it goes from, I didn't practice enough today, over to, I'm a piece of crap. Right? Some of you are laughing, so like me, you've been down that road. Again, we've got to set the realistic standard, doing the best we can with what we have. Now, that takes a certain level of self-honesty. Great. That's part of our practice. That's part of being awake, is having self-honesty. Right? Some of you are working with the precepts now. We talk about the precept of not lying. Well, not lying. One aspect of not lying is not lying to ourselves, not deceiving ourselves. And that cuts both ways. And we talk about loving kindness and compassion. And I won't ask for the show of hands on this, but most of us are not very good at giving that loving kindness and compassion to ourselves. When we fall short for some reason, or we make a mistake, or we simply can't get to something. We can be kind to others and merciless to ourselves, which is not very healthy. So we need to relinquish these ideas of perfection and purity. We need to let go of them, just like we let go of everything else. Purity. I'm never going to have an angry thought. I'm never going to attach to anything. Right? I mean, I was reading it again. I mean, some of this we have to blame on Shakyamuni Buddha, because he started this. We've talked about these things, talked about purifying the mind. Well, so was he wrong? No. but it's process. It's process. It comes from letting go tens of thousands of times, of practicing constantly. Will we succeed in getting rid of anger? I can only speak for myself. I know that I don't have enough years left in this lifetime, and even if I have a bunch of other lifetimes, it's going to be a challenge, right? Purity. Just like perfection, unattainable. And it becomes a barrier to the idea that I can have loving kindness and compassion for myself. And it's like, boy, if I gave you any idea that I was any good at any of this, then I'd be violating some precepts right now. I'm not. I struggle with it every day. Guess what? That's what practice is. Struggle may be too strong a word, but focusing and trying every day to improve a little in these various aspects of our lives, to let go of perfectionism a little, to let go of purity a little, to gain compassion and loving kindness a little, each and every day, to let go of anger a little, process. And I believe that's all that's expected of us. To keep trying, to keep working the process, to keep showing up. But with a very clear understanding that the goal is, got another AA saying here, spiritual progress, not spiritual perfection. That's a wonderful saying. Spiritual progress, not spiritual perfection. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. A little bit every day, progress. Thank you.
Having come from a tradition where there were commandments rather than precepts, and if you didn't obey, then you got to spend all of your eternal life in the fires of hell. When I was studying the precepts and going through them, I was so impressed and relieved at the concept of just see where you are on that continuum of violation to achievement of the goals, and just move a little bit, and just identify a little closer in the right direction. And that it just makes so much sense, and relieved me of most of my fear of the fires of hell. Still a little. So I do appreciate that about studying Buddhism. So thank you for the reminder.
Yeah. And Susan, the good news is that if there are fires of hell, you're going to have some good company there.
That's how it goes. Yep. Plenty to eat and drink.
Haven't I heard somewhere that this moment right here now is perfect?
Whoever would have said such a thing?
Would Dogen have said such a thing?
He might have. He might have. It is.
Eckhart Tolle would have said that.
What's that?
Eckhart Tolle.
Eckhart Tolle. Peter Walsman known to say it also, because it's true. It absolutely is true. This moment is perfect. Every moment is perfect, perfect and complete. At a certain level of reality.
A perfect manifestation of all the causes and conditions that have been at play until now, this moment. That's one way I've heard it.
Yeah, that's it's sort of a somewhat different, it is right now, right now. And as with it 90 degrees in Florida and tornadoes in South Portland and God knows what else, it's still complete and perfect at this moment, in that sense. And we can experience that. We do experience that, when we're talking about, deep samadhi. Those of you that, when you sit, experience deep samadhi. Is there anything wrong? Complete and perfect. Realization, complete and perfect. And yet, say that to the person who's living on the cardboard box in this rainstorm. Say that for the mother who's trying to figure out how to get enough empty bottles redeemed to get her kids formula. So we live in this paradox, relative and absolute, right? In the absolute sense, that's true. And in the relative sense, all the pain, the suffering, the craziness, and so on. That's why we need to, interact. Interestingly enough, one of the things I was reading this article on purity. That's kind of what got me started on this. One of the things that the traditions that focus on this a little differently, like Zen, with Tibetan Buddhism being one, is that the cure is service to others. Service to others. Do you guys know the stories of Milarepa and Marpa? Okay, well, in this case, it wasn't service to others, but he had been, I forget which was who knows, it's been so many years, but had been he had been a murderer. And he came to Marpa, I believe, was the teacher. And Marpa had him build a house out of stone. And when he finished that house, I don't know how long it took him, he went to Marpa and said, I finished the house. And Marpa said, good, take it down. So he spent another year or whatever taking all the stones down. He went back to Marpa and said, I finished the house. And he said, good, now build it again. And he repeated this process several times. And in that way, he sort of expiated the karma of his crimes. But but service to others is transformative, right? And so, and that was how, in the early teachings, we were to cleanse our karma. Now we don't understand. Most of us do not understand karma in that way these days. And back to the fires of hell, that, well, in the Buddhist terms, it would be being reborn as a worm or something because we've done these terrible things. But we don't understand that literally anymore. Dido used to talk about it in terms of just cause and effect. And I think Steph, similarly, cause and effect. It kind of makes sense, and it's very, in my mind, very global. The effect and the cause may not be closely associated, but every time I affect the one body in a negative way, every time I cause some pain or some suffering or some harm, that is out there. That energy is there. Does it come back to me directly? Well, it is one body. So yes, it does. Right? It's like what we're going through now with the environment. Every time I don't recycle something, I don't see terrible consequences. Right? If I take a plastic bottle and throw it in the trash, nothing happens, lightning doesn't strike, so on and so forth. But the cumulative effect of throwing plastic bottles in the trash is that our bodies are all contaminated with PFAS, and our waters, so on and so forth. And we've got an ocean that's full of these things, thousands of square miles of floating trash, And so does that come back to me? Yeah, it absolutely comes back to me. Absolutely, because I live in this world and I'm impacted. But I love that idea that serving others purifies our karma. Not because I believe in karma, but because I believe in value. Oh, here's that AA thing again. It's interesting. They had some tremendous wisdom in creating that program. How do you heal from your alcoholism? You serve others, right? That's part of that. So to me, that's a beautiful concept.
Hey, Peter, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Isn't, in a way, seeking perfection and purity another form of attachment?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And why is it such a strong aspect of our tradition? Is it cultural, going back to how those are artifacts of even ancient Japanese culture?
That would be my guess. I've never thought that through, but I think that's probably right. Not just Japanese culture, Asian culture more generally, but our culture too, right? I mean, we have this whole perfectionism thing, and this idea that if we don't achieve that we are flawed, that there's something wrong with us, as opposed to the idea that the project is impossible, that we're attaching to a goal that's unrealistic. And yet we hold that tension, right? That dialectic. I mean, if we need to try to do better. we are trying to do better, you know. It's just understanding that we're not ever going to be perfect. We're not ever going to be pure. We're not, you know, we're going to have that angry thought. We're going to have that sexual thought, whatever it is, we're going to be human beings, and we're going to try to do better. Both things, you know, both things.
I do have one thought about, you know, the perfection of the rituals of Zen, you know, that, you know, maybe in a monastic setting where people are living there for decades, it's not unnatural if you know, they're doing these same rituals over and over again. And maybe it doesn't have to be a matter of such great attachment or longing or pushing for perfection, for eventually to really get to be pretty, you know, pretty well done over time, just from practice, as opposed to being obsessed with perfection. But when you're not in that setting, and, you know, you'd have hardly any time to do it, and then you think you have to be perfect, then that, you know, that may be more a matter of attachment and something that isn't realistic. Just a thought.
Well, yes, absolutely. And the other thing is, you know, we as Americans are slobs. I mean, Japanese people are inherently so much more careful, so much neat, you know. And look at their culture, look at their woodworking, look at the things, the arts that they have, beautiful, intricate, you know, and enormous patience, you know, and we don't have that. So in a sense, it's what you said, Gary, and it's also that it's that much more alien to us and to our culture. You know, when we started out up in Orono, we had a young Japanese woman in the Sangha. She had come over from Japan. I think she was doing some studies at UMO, and you know, and everything she did, all her movements were exquisite. You know, she didn't know how to do sloppy. You know, we know how to do sloppy. If you know, if that's a positive attribute, we have it.
Not just Japanese, because I lived in Japan for 5 years and I was handling membership applications from people from all nations. And if it was incorrect, incomplete, or sloppy, it was an American. If it was beautifully done, it was a German or a Brit or an Indian or an Australian or a Japanese or Chinese. But the Americans consistently were careless. With our Puritan background, we're still doing this.
Yeah,
Well,
it's okay. Go ahead.
well, at the risk of stereotyping Japanese culture and comparing it to our culture, is that there's a certain amount of personal freedom that I think we have that somehow is not there for the Japanese in quite the same way, because of their culture and the way they're trained, and they're, you know, this having to do everything just right. And then it bleeds into things like how innovative and free we are to think about different things and to, you know, adopt a new, like we're here adopting Zen because we're open-minded in those types of things. I think in some ways we can be, it allows for that open mind a little more, even though it's not perfect, but I think that's kind of one of the differences in the tension we hold, is keeping this open mind and being, and that sense of personal freedom, which sometimes has a negative consequence too. But that's kind of, I think, one of the differences between our cultures. Oh, no, did I leave?
Yeah, well, there are certainly trade-offs to everything, and it's not my intention to suggest that Japanese culture is better or worse. It's just different, right? And we have, but when we try to adopt it, that's where too literally, that's where the problem comes along, because we don't have a lifetime of training. We start doing Zen at 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years old, and having lived in this culture, and I think that's, and even that's not a problem. It's the striving to be perfect. I've mentioned, I come back often to the Winnicott, British psychologist, and he had a concept that he called the good enough mother. And it to me, it's a very sort of liberating concept. What he said was basically, there's no such thing as the perfect mother. Nobody can be a perfect mother, but as long as the mother is good enough, the kids come out all right, and that's all that the mother has to be, is good enough. And I think that applies in so many aspects of our lives. We just have to be good enough. And I also think we have to be authentic to who we are, right? And to our personalities, to our lives, to our lifestyles, to all of those things. Jim and I were talking earlier a little bit about Daido Roshi and his talks. His Dharma talks were works of literature. He probably spent, I don't know, 50 hours writing a talk, and it was full of Dogen references and metaphors. And, when I studied there for about 10 years, and in the 10 years, I never fully understood one of his talks. And they'd always start out kind of like, I'd go, oh, I'm getting it. I understand what he's talking about. And then by the end of the talk, I'd be like, what did he say? They were unbelievable, because they were so full of the Dogen metaphors, and they were just exquisite. I can't do that. And it would be ridiculous for me to try. So here I am, I speak extemporaneously. That's where I'm at home. That's expressing who I am. So that's the other thing. Who are we? And Daido would, God rest his soul, would probably feel ridiculous talking the way I do. And I would be absolutely, and that's not a value judgment. That's also being authentic to who we are.
I recall a while ago seeing something in a Zen book, and it was talking about being authentic to who you are. And he said something to the effect of, don't seek the truth. You don't have to seek the truth. You don't have to seek who your authentic self is. Just drop your judgments. And that made me think quite a bit. my authentic self is there. I don't really need to seek it. I guess truth is there. But somehow we feel we need to seek it. But if we drop judgments, wow, the world changes.
Thank you. Do we have a precept about that?
Well, not blaming others would be a judgment. Blaming someone else is a judgment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not elevating ourselves and blaming others. Not speaking of others' errors and faults.
And it could apply to ourselves too. Not looking at others and saying, oh, they're so much better off than I am.
Well, that's that self-compassion. That one is so tough, right? It's so tough not to compare like that. Not to always sort of come up short. You know. And again, that tension, being who we are, being authentic to who we are, and trying to be better. In a way that doesn't shame us, blame us, you know. My friend Jim talks about shame attacks, you know. we get shame attacks and we start beating on ourselves. Very destructive.
And when I look at different cultures and compare ours to it, my perception is that in our culture there's so much competition. Be better than someone else. And it starts in schools and high school, it's rampant. Get into the best college and then get the best job and be better than someone else. So different than the indigenous people we slaughtered a few hundred years ago.
You know, I think the difficulty is when we take things to extremes. There's something I was listening to recently just reminded me that back in the 80s, the slogan was, "He who dies with the most toys wins." Oh, I know. I was having a conversation about the fact that it was talking about finite versus infinite activities, and you know, life is not the game of life is not finite. There's no day that we declare the winner, right? You know, and in that sense, it goes on, you know, and as long as we're alive, we're involved, you know, and there are people these days looking to be the winner. They're looking for that outcome, which is not an outcome that you can have in an infinite, you know, there's no day the president or somebody's going to say, okay, Americans, we're going to announce the winners today. You know, it doesn't happen, right? So that whole idea, we're seeking something that is not a realistic outcome in terms of our lives. If we're looking for that, if we're looking for that approbation, if we're looking for the award, it's not there. He who dies with the most toy wins. What an extraordinary philosophy of life. You know. I think that's a good note to close on.
Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.